Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everyone who've joined from different parts of the world. I'm Prateek Bagaria, and I'm partner with Singularity Legal. Singularity is an international dispute boutique, focuses on energy and infrastructure disputes in Asia and Africa. And today we bring to you this panel on investment trends and challenges while investing in hydro projects in Africa. Africa needs more power. An estimated 579 million Africans have no ready access to electricity. The United Nations have estimated that Africa's population will double by 2050, amounting to approximately 2.5 billion people, with electricity demands expected to triple by 2040. As Africa continues to urbanize, industrialize, and become a global economic force, electricity access must improve. Improved access to reliable, clean, and safe power is an essential step for African countries to meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Technology development, falling costs for renewable energies, innovative approaches, network effects, and digitalization are now opening new opportunities and making an indisputable business case for renewables. With abundant indigenous resources, Africa is well placed to leverage this potential. However, the potential and the availability of cost-effective technologies alone are not sufficient. Seizing this opportunity will require strong political will, attractive investment frameworks, and holistic policy approach to fully reap the benefits of renewable energy. It also means that the current average annual investment in the African energy system must be substantially increased by 2030. In this context, the investment made to address the severe economic consequences of COVID-19 crisis in Africa must spur the continent's transition towards a sustainable energy future. A relapse into the unsustainable economic patterns as happened around the world after the 2007 and 2008 financial crisis should be avoided. The new Partnership for Renewable Energy Transition in Africa aims to support a green economic recovery. Hydropower is the main renewable source in Africa, but hydropower, particularly for large-scale projects, is also complex and capital intensive. Despite sufficient funds, there is lack of enthusiasm observed amongst investors. The hydropower projects have delivered both constructive outcomes as well as disruptive surprises to investors. On the one hand, they have provided reliable and cheap source of electricity, but on the other, due to the uncontrolled exposure to climatic uncertainties and ignorance, they have resulted in costly penalties to stakeholders. Notably, to date, very little privately funded hydro project investment has taken place. This is in part driven by the perceived risk of investing in Africa electricity market. The financial risk can be looked at into three perspectives. The first one, to the lenders, which can come from diversion of funds. The second one, to the developers, which can come from delays and variations in scope of work. And third, to all other parties involved from the arbitration and unreasonable action of state or geopolitical instability. The underlying theme of these risks comprise commercial and legal risks, matters such as customary land rights, resettlements, and political risks, technical risks involved during the currency of the project at various phases, and environmental and hydrological issues. Today, we have three eminent speakers to discuss the investor's view on investment trends and challenges in hydropower in Africa from three parts of the world: Europe, America, and Africa. Starting with Europe, we have Oliver Tiricca. He is a power engineer at the European Investment Bank with over 26 years of experience and has supervised on more than 20 complex procurement processes of large public projects in accordance with the EBRD and EIB public procurement rules. We have Sylvie Mahiu. She is a principal investment officer at African Development Bank and has led the appraisal, struck negotiations, and power generation projects totaling to 1.5 gigawatt of capacity across Africa. We also have Chris. He is joined from Power Africa, a US agency for international development in 2014, and is the hydropower and private sector lead for investors. He has worked at several startup companies, including the energy efficient company Next Step Living, where he wrote the business plan and served as the CEO and the interim CFO. Thank you all for joining us for this session. And Oliver, I would like to start from you. What has been EIB's perspective to hydropower in Africa? What are the biggest challenges you see? What are the issues? What is EIB's outlook over the next few years? And what do you see as a key opportunities in this area?
Well, thanks a lot, Prateek. It's a great pleasure to participate in today's event. Sorry, Anshal, I think I don't have the possibility to share a content as a panelist. I am as a panelist, but I still cannot share the presentation. Could you give me the access, please?
Shreya, Iqbal, can we make Olivia the host, give him the presenter rights, please?
I thought, it was working yesterday. I'm sorry for this.
No worries at all. I think, please do see if...
Yes, that's fine now. So I'll share the presentation, and then I will leave the floor to my colleague Murat, which is a loan officer at the European Investment Bank, and focused on Africa, in particular Northern Africa, but also Africa and sovereign deal. Sorry, I will very quickly. Sorry for that. Oh my God. You see, I'm in some troubles. Share. Do you see my screen now?
Yes, we do.
Yeah,
okay.
Olivia.
Sorry for the delay. So I leave the floor to my colleague Murat now. Murat, please. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you very much, Olivier. Well, good morning and good afternoon. I'm Murat Ilker, as Olivier presented me, working as loan officer at the European Investment Bank. You would refer to me as the banker, actually, at the EIB. And Olivier Tricas, working more on the engineering side at the EIB. And what I want to do is really to have a short description of the EIB, its work, its overview, and also to see on where we are putting our focus. Maybe we can go over to the second slide, Olivier, please. Thanks a lot. So first things first, the EIB is the bank of the European Union because its shareholders are, of course, the member states of the EU. And very recently, it has decided to become also the climate bank of the EU as the largest multilateral development bank, by the way, on the world. So as the EU bank, we strongly support the EU climate policy in the EU, but also outside the EU. And we have a very, we would say, maybe comprehensive decarbonization targets and a stronger climate policy of the EU being, let's say, laid out and implemented as a lender in the world. So we have the target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40%. Of course, comparing to 1990 levels, and also to increase dramatically the share of renewable energy to 32%, and to see at least energy savings at 32.5%. As a climate bank, what we want to become by 2025, we want at least to reach 50% of a financing that will be specifically dedicated to climate action. And for that, of course, the financing needs will be drastic and quite huge. What we are estimating to be around 1 trillion between 2021 and 2030. So to also give you the news, I don't know if that really spread it around. The EIB has decided under the new international aid cooperation architecture of the EU to create its development branch starting from 2022. This will definitely help to mainstream investments outside the EU, because the EIB financing mainly, so its core activity financing being in the EU, but to also have a mainstream financing scheme outside of the EU, we will have this development branch created, noting that the intervention modalities are being still discussed. So all in all, we are the largest multilateral development bank. We have the capacity to have a large tickets. I mean, it can go from 500 million euros to 1,000 million euros, and these financings can be very concessional and help for developing markets to implement their priority investments. So maybe we can go over to second slide, Olivier, to have an overview of the results that we had in the 2020. So as you see, the lending results of the EIB are always between 60 or 80 billion euros. So 2020, which was marked, by the way, of course, by the COVID, but did not prevent us from still intervening to finance infrastructure programs. So in the EU, we had a 60, almost a 67 billion euros of lending, and outside the EU, you see, which is a smaller proportion, but still quite important, of 10 billion euros externally, and in Sub-Saharan Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific, having a share of 2.26 billion. So maybe on the next slide, we can also briefly present what the EIB is doing on detail. So basically, as a lending institution, as an IFI, as an international financial institution, the EIB has the full palette of financing products. So from private to public sector, going through banks, funds, but also from guarantee schemes and equity. So meaning that for hydropower, maybe the three columns on the right, which make more sense. But of course, Olivia will have a much larger view and discussion on that later on. Financing corporates, project finance, of course, a public sector where our financing is also needed. The most maybe interesting here is that we have also the capacity to accompany the clients with the technical assistances, which can be preparing investment programs, financing feasibilities, pre-feasibilities, but also implementing market studies, for example, which is in line, I mean, which is related to our topic to some extent. We are currently financing an energy storage strategy for the Moroccan grid, which is still ongoing. And which will help actually to identify the storage capacities, of course, not only of Morocco. We are also doing the same thing in Georgia, which is actually almost completed. But we can also have technical assistance after signature of the loan for implementation, but also for capacity building. So maybe on the next slide. Also to tell you that the EIB, of course, we are open to collaborate with the private sector, public sector, and funds and other stakeholders that may be involved in financing schemes. But we are very much driven, as we've seen also in the beginning, by EU policies. We are the bank of the EU, which operationally means that we are following EU directives, and we are also driven by our lending policies. And the latest lending policy, which was approved for us in this sector, is the energy lending policy approved in 2019, in addition to the Climate Bank Roadmap, which was approved in 2020. And in this lending policy, we have 5 pillars that you also see on the slide, which is stopping to finance fossil fuels by end 2021, unlocking energy efficiency, decarbonization, of course, securing the infrastructure for the electricity grid, and to support innovations. Having in mind that the 3 last pillars being related indirectly and directly to our topic here. So that's from my side. So I will hand over to Olivier to get into the nitty-gritty of our topic. Thanks a lot for listening.
Sorry, yes, I've got some issue with the microphone. Murat, do you want to continue to present this slide, or is it fine if I do that for you?
I think you will have more deep insight on that, Olivier. I think it's more useful that you present it. Thank you.
So I think we are not going to answer directly to the question. We're not going to escape this very interesting the discussion ahead of us. What has been the perspective of EIB in Africa? So basically the big numbers in the past 9 years, well, nearly 10 years, so is 40 billion investment worldwide in renewable, of which only 7% in Africa. But that's also, due to the mandate of the bank, which is first, the European bank, so bank, inside the EU, operating inside the EU. Mostly, 90% of our operation is in the EU, as said by Murat. So it is, very much, similar, for renewable and the side, and Africa is a very important, market for us. Very important for different reasons. In the hydropower, out of these 40 billion of renewable, is only 6% of it, which is hydropower in the past 10 years. A bit more, if we aggregate the storage, so 1 billion, a lot of these projects, again, are taking place inside Europe. And the portion of Africa is basically, 300 million loan in the past 10 years for 13 projects. So again, rather, more or less, 10%. What has been the profile of our project in the past years? And there, I'm talking about Africa. We have, basically, 2 big type of project. One is a large hydropower scheme. So that could be, 1,000 megawatt, which are promoted, by public utilities and state. But we mostly, intervene in the private sector, so supporting a private investment in the hydropower scheme, of course, of smaller size. We do pump storage in Morocco. We support our colleagues and the government of Morocco in terms of storage development. However, in Africa, storage until now was not a priority, and we see that. We'll see that in the future. We see that as a potential for Africa. And basically, greenfield projects. So these to say that we were not very much engaged into rehabilitation of large schemes, for example. What are the biggest challenges and issues? Well, here I'll be brief. This is a list, I would say, classic that everybody, in the hydro sector, knows. It's hydro is site specific. It's extensively criticized by the public sector and the NGOs, of course, and this is the duality of hydropower. On one hand, it brings huge additionality to the energy sector, to the electricity sector, and in particular, supporting renewable. On the other hand, it does have a lot of impact, environmental and social, and then raise concern from the public. Development, freshwater uses and stresses, of course, biodiversity, wildlife in catastrophic decline. I think that the last COP26 put an emphasis on deforestation, and that could be, I mean, also an issue in a lot of hydro projects because of the footprint on the land. Climate change and dam safety are classic. Also, public communication is very important. And resettlement. These are, I mean, usual, I mean, challenges and issues that anybody, I mean, developers, promoters, and also, I mean, financiers are facing when we are dealing, I mean, with hydropower. However, I mean, there are solutions, of course, for each of them, and that we can discuss it aside. But here, I mean, the question was about the challenges and issues, and in particular, I mean, Africa. So in Africa, I think that what we have faced first and foremost as biggest challenges is the fact that the master planning are aimed at developing, I mean, hydro as a solution, as a big infrastructure, promoting job, and basically not being put in competition with other alternatives which could make sense in Africa, like solar and wind, are not enough. So master planning, renewable strategy is something which is a big issues in Africa, so lack of that, of these strategies. When it comes to dealing with public utilities, we see, I mean, this large project coming, huge project in Africa, I mean, compared to other countries where we operate. So we can talk about thousands of megawatts. So that requires, I mean, huge capex, of course, which pose a question on the financial structure of such a project and how to cover the long implementation timeline, because we do have some limit in terms of the loan proceeds availability. Generally 5-6 years, no more. While, I mean, hydropower project could be in a timeline of 10 years or more. Another one, I mean, typical also in Africa is we see financial beneficiary questions. So in terms of balancing of benefits and profits between the private sector and the public sector when the project is promoted by the public sector. So in other words, we would welcome, I mean, much more, I mean, a PPP type of approach. So to say, I mean, a higher level of participation of the end users, ultimate beneficiaries to the cost of the project when these are in capacity to pay. And this is very often, I mean, the case in Africa where mining companies, I mean, for example, are a lot benefiting from a hydro project in countries, and unfortunately, I mean, paying the electricity at a very low price, I would say, or not contributing, I mean, to the development of the project. Others, I mean, typical issues in private investment in Africa there is more about, I would say, not the capex is not elevated, I mean, for private finance or private investment. However, I mean, the specific cost, we find the specific cost way above international market. So we see, I mean, prices way above, I mean, 4,000 euro per kilowatt, I mean, 8,000, 6,000, and that is not in line with international market elsewhere outside Africa. This point, we don't see that, I mean, for public sector. So there, I mean, there could be, I mean, questions, I mean, related to that. The other point, obviously, is technical partners, because we see a lot of funds investing in Africa, a short-term view, a less industrial, I mean, approach. A second important point, I mean, for the private sector that we see, and which is hinting, I mean, the pace of development of the project and the approval of the project, in particular for EIB, this is the input or the assumptions which are basically over-optimistic in terms of generation capacity or actual versus the actual demand. So in other words, we have seen, I mean, project where the generation capacity is double the actual demand on the basis of optimistic demand forecast, while the countries has no electrification in a nutshell. So there are, I mean, huge question in terms of the economic benefit of such a project. And again, I mean, balancing between the private and public sector. Last 2 points, classic one, local content requirement. Unfortunately, I mean, this is not supported, I mean, by our rules. And of course, I mean, lack of river basin approach. This refers to the strategy. and lack of climate change risk assessment in line with IHA sustainability tools. And I'd like to mention, the huge and good work from our colleagues from IHE, World Bank, AFD, and other colleagues in BRD in that sense to support and to promote sustainable hydropower sector. What is the outlook, for us in Africa? So we do have a portfolio of 2 billion, potentially, 2 billion loans for total project cost of 12 billion. We see, as an outlook, of course, the huge, continuous, let's say, development of hydropower, in particular in Africa, based on the San Jose Declaration. And I'd like to flag again, this declaration, which may be, good intention, but which has to translate into actions, of course, and we will support, these projects who are developed in line with this spirit of the San Jose Declaration in a way more smoother and quicker way, of course. And I guess it's going to be the same. I don't want to speak for the other IFIs, but for a lot of promoter, we see funds who are a lot also endorsing this a good practice approach in their side letter, and we welcome that, to be clear on this. As an outlook, of course, we would expect rehabilitation to take a greater place in Africa in the near future. The water energy nexus also to be a core issues and a promoter of hydropower in the future in light of climate change. We do support hybrid technology. However, we have not been approached. And one point is that we are very cautious on the way of why promoting, a combined PV solar floating PV solar and a hydro, while we could do that, separately with a higher benefit for the community. So we understand, that there is interest from the promoter, but it has to match also the interest of the country and the community. And we're very, very much, on this. A last point is the hydropower storage that we see in the future, of course, and particularly in Northern Africa. We welcome that. This is very important, to promote again, renewable and the green conversion. So this is clear. However, a couple of points. This when developing storage, and I guess, this is going to be the object of other discussion. It is a last resort solution in functioning market. This is very important. So it is not the solution in countries where basically the market, the demand is not properly managed, or the offer is not properly managed. There are other points which you could read also in this point, but in particular, we are promoting a master planning approach specific to storage also in countries in order to identify the best alternative for hydropower for storage. Very similarly, to what is done for hydropower versus other alternatives for generation. Key opportunity, as my colleague said, we start a development branch in 2022, so we'll provide more support to countries' policy. Although we did in the past, but we will be more active in this field also, with a key purpose to decarbonizing electricity grid. That's very important to for us, that we share a common purpose. When during our collaboration with the clients, and we kindly refer you to our guidelines on hydropower development, where there is a number of 89 points, which helps to understand what are the key points that we are promoting, be it for private investor, public investor, funds, or long-term investors. Thanks a lot for this. I hope I've not been too long. We had a lot to say, and there is a lot to say. Leave the floor to you, and thanks a lot for listening to us.
Thank you so much, Oliver, and that really was very enlightening to hear AIB's view, and it was pretty extensive the way you covered it. My question now is to Sylvie, and we want to hear from you on what your view is sitting in Africa. What's the African Development Bank view on the same topics. What has been their perspective to hydropower in Africa? What do you see as the biggest challenges? What's AFDB's outlook in the next 5 years? And what do you see as the key areas of opportunities and concerns?
Thank you very much, Pratik. First of all, I want to thank you for inviting the African Development Bank to take part in this very imminent panel discussion alongside our partners, the EIB and USAID. So you've said it, but let me repeat it because it's so important that it is estimated that today, half of the African population, so about 600 million people, do not have access to electricity. Tomorrow, our population is set to double, reaching about 2.5 billion people by 2050, with electricity demand expected to triple within the next 20 years. So that gigantic need for electricity in Africa, combined with the requisite for us to embark in a clean energy transition, to join the global efforts against global warming, has put hydropower at the heart and at the forefront of Africa's energy agenda. So for the years to come, we expect hydropower development to play a critical role in providing clean, reliable, affordable energy to the continent, and also in contributing to achieving the 2063 agenda set by the African Union to allow socio-economic transformation of Africa. It's been said, hydropower is the primary renewable source in Africa. However, barely 10% of our hydropower potential is being exploited at the moment. And hydropower only represents 15% of the continent's energy mix. So it is said that it is forecasted that this will increase up to 23% by 2040 due to our efforts in reaching universal access and the clean energy transition. So this twin objective of universal energy access and clean energy transition puts a greater need for hydropower development in Africa, not only for us to meet our required baseload needs, but also to help stabilizing the grid and help enhancing the flexibility in the power system that is required to smoothly integrate intermittent renewable energy sources such as solar and wind. And besides, we should not forget that hydropower has additional benefits such as flood protection, drought mitigation, which are of critical importance for Africa, especially in the context of climate change. So before I go on, I just want to make sure that, yeah, I see that the presentation is on, so I'm already at slide 3. So I don't have the control. Yes, here it is. So in 2016, the African Development Bank launched the New Deal on Energy for Africa with the ambitious goal of reaching universal electricity access by 2025. And to reach that goal in a safe, reliable, sustainable, and affordable way, the African Development Bank is relying mostly on renewable energy sources: solar, wind, biomass, geothermal, and of course, hydro. And when it comes to hydro, our energy policy is placing the focus on large, transformative hydropower schemes, preferably with a regional scope that comply fully with our environmental and social safeguards, and that take into account climate change implications into their design. Next slide, please. So we at the African Development Bank have a large experience with financing hydropower in Africa, both through sovereign schemes, but also PPP and IPP schemes. Myself, I joined the AFDB 10 years ago, and for the best part of that decade, I worked with the private sector infrastructure and PPP department. And there, what we have observed is that despite the many challenges in developing hydropower in Africa, which I will touch upon in a minute, despite those challenges, we are observing in the past 5 years an increasing appetite by the private sector to invest in hydropower in Africa, which is encouraging. So next slide, please. So practically, you've said it. Hydropower, especially when it comes to large-scale infrastructure, is complex. It's capital intensive, with very high perceived or actual risks that are linked to environmental, commercial, financial, technical, regulatory issues. I will not go into each of the blocks of those issues in the next 2 slides, but let me highlight a few that are particular importance for us at the African Development Bank. And I think in all DFIs, such as EIB, is the environmental and social challenges first. We lenders, especially DFI, are very, very cautious about the degree of environmental and ecological impact of the project, the extent to which we're going to have a loss of biodiversity, a loss of soil quality, land degradation, erosion, all these impacts, if they cannot be either avoided, which is best, or mitigated in a proper manner, will lead us to simply walk away from the transaction. And we've done that in the past. So paramount importance on environmental and social issues. Also climate change. You know that Africa is going to be disproportionately impacted by climate change. And therefore, it's very important for us to ensure that any hydropower infrastructure in which we engage is climate resilient in its design and is conceived and built in a way as to withstand extreme variations in hydrology, rainfall, temperatures, and other severe weather events. And of course, socially, Olivier and Murat mentioned it. There are challenges that are linked with land acquisition, compensations of communities, resettlements, and that require extensive consultations with community, extensive awareness campaigns, which are likely to increase the lead time and the preparation phase of those projects and also the costs. And we are cognizant of that. It's not easy to adhere to those standards, but it is paramount for us to engage and consider financing HPPs in Africa. So at the technical level, we have challenges that are maybe more specific to our continent than others. First of all, it's very difficult to find bankable feasibility studies for HPP in Africa. It's very difficult to come across data that is reliable and that is covering an enough period of time so that that data can be meaningful and can be credible when it comes to then do the projections. So we lack meteorological data, hydrologic data, even demand projections sometimes can be questionable, and therefore that comes with challenges when it comes to the credibility of the outputs estimates and also the cash flow generation from a hydropower scheme, which is of course a challenge for lenders. Another technical issue which is specific to our continent is the fact that our transmission and distribution network is underdeveloped. So we have that challenge that even though we can put a lot of megawatts, we can produce a lot of megawatts using our hydropower potential, we're gonna face the challenge to have that power being evacuated and distributed and absorbed by the end consumers, because simply there are no networks to do that. So in East Africa, for example, in Ethiopia, in Tanzania, or in Central Africa, like in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where I'm from, we have this vast hydropower potential, but we lack the extensive evacuation corridors to allow that power to be distributed in other parts of the continents, because we wouldn't be able to absorb all that energy in country anyway, so it will have to be distributed, and we lack those distribution and transmission networks. Fortunately, there are initiatives to fill that infrastructure in transmission and distribution infrastructure gaps. For example, the African Development Bank, together with the JICA, is currently supporting the construction of a 500 high voltage transmission line linking Tanzania and Kenya, which is actually part of a bigger electricity, East Africa electricity highway, which will have a transfer capacity of 2,000 megawatts and will be a major link in the power transfer in the East Africa power pool between Ethiopia notably, but also Sudan and Egypt. So in order to harness really that vast hydropower potential that we have on the continent, more investment in the high capacity transmission networks will be required. And let me touch also commercially on some points that are maybe not specific only to hydropower in Africa, but that are generally seen in power projects on the continent and which are linked to a utility or an off-taker that is generally low performing or like creditworthiness. Also, we have generally a currency and convertibility risks due to the fact that, unfortunately, our local capital markets are also underdeveloped and don't give the opportunity to provide loans in local currency at the terms that would make economical sense for such capital intensive projects. And therefore, oftentimes you'll have a mismatch between the currency on the power purchase agreement and the currency of the loan, which generates a risk that needs to be addressed. Hedging, for example, which comes with costs, right? And another commercial aspect or challenge is the foreign exchange fluctuation and availability, which in some countries in Africa, notably Ethiopia at the moment, has been a major roadblock in the advancement of IPP's development, simply because there are now no foreign exchange available in the country. So I don't know where we are in the slides. Yeah, can you maybe go to maybe 4 slides forward? Yes. Yes, this one. So this is simply to say that we have this massive hydropower potential, 90% untapped, showing that the hydropower development in Africa has been way too low compared to other regions. But at the same time, that provides with an immense opportunity to, of course, increase the level of investment in hydropower in the continent. Next slide, please. So when it comes to opportunities and our outlook, let me just say first that African governments are really trying to increase the penetration of renewable energy sources, solar, wind, into their grids. And because of that, we will need to develop new hydropower scheme, but also, as Olivier alluded to, we need to rehabilitate the existing decaying hydropower fleet on the continent. So we need not only new investments, we also need modernization of what's existing, because those underperforming, non-operational power plants there are many of them across the continent. They can be rehabilitated, refurbished at a fraction of the cost, and with much less environmental and social impacts and risks. And the AFDB has been engaging in that trajectory, notably right now in Mozambique with the 2,075 megawatts hydropower Carabassa project that we are rehabilitating together with a private partner. There is also the opportunity with, African governments being fully aware of the importance of developing hydropower. Sustainable energy is at the heart of national development plans across Africa. Out of 53 African nationally determined contribution, virtually all of them have renewable energy targets. African governments are aware that hydropower will help them reach universal access, lower tariff, and therefore are putting in place policies to attract private sector into investing in this area. There are many hydropower projects being built right now in the continent, more even being developed and more under an IPP scheme, as I mentioned earlier, which is very encouraging. Of course, we said that there has been a low level of privately funded investment in the energy sector in Africa. This is due to all these risks that we have highlighted before. But the good news is that investors are also realizing that though those risks exist and they're real, they're really real, they can also be mitigated at acceptable costs using contractual frameworks, de-risking instruments such as partial risk guarantees, political risk insurance, other insurance covers, and some other credit enhancement mechanisms for those weak off-takers in Africa. Hydropower is capital intensive. When you do it under an IPP scheme or project finance scheme, the cost of finance only is frankly daunting, representing up to 25% of the total project cost sometimes. But there is an opportunity here to take advantage of blended finance. We have more and more grants and concessional resources available to support the preparation and the financing of those green baseload projects. The African Development Bank has a few, such as the Sustainable Energy for All Fund, the GCF the Green Climate Fund, Africa 50, which is an offshoot of the African Development Bank, supporting also preparation of green projects. So these blended finance is great opportunities for investors to improve the economics of capital-intensive IPP infrastructures. And finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, even though our policy basically puts the focus on large-scale hydropower plants, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that smaller scale, less capital-intensive hydropower projects are also a solution for Africa. Smaller projects can be powered by the flow of the river without big dam being built, and therefore with much more limited environmental and social impacts. Thank you.
I think you're still on mute.
Sorry, thank you for that. Thank you, Sylvie. I think it's been very detailed and encouraging to hear this view, and the audience has benefited from this diverse outlook, both from Europe and Africa. And I'll take this cue to move to Chris and get his perspective and the view from America on this. Chris, there are several renewable resources which we have explored today. And my question is, with so many challenges, so many risks which people flag about hydro, some larger than what it would be in solar or other projects, why should one choose hydro? Why should hydro be the poster boy of renewable, and what makes it suitable for Africa?
Good morning all. So I'm Chris Troy from Power Africa. Just a very, very brief intro to who we are, what we do. So Power Africa is part of it's a program that is coordinated by the U.S. International Agency for Development, which is in partnership with there's a total of 12 U.S. government agencies, and it's basically like an open source program to develop energy throughout Africa. By that, what I mean is we're like an ecosystem working with a lot of international development partners such as AFDB, many European entities, governments of our newest entity of our 20 development partners is the government of Denmark. We just renewed an MOU with the government of Norway. We also have Canada, South Korea, Japan, et cetera, working with the IFC and World Bank. And then we have about 150 private sector partners, and they're the ones actually doing the work to get the projects built. We're not actually building anything, but we're facilitating that work with our technical assistance on the ground. So these partners, these private sector partners, and we enjoy many companies that are based in Africa, Europe. We've got some from Japan. We've got some Canadian partners we work very closely with. So as I said, it's like an open source architecture, like an ecosystem. So when we look at now, to the question, why is hydro being considered? Well, hydropower is like a backbone base load power source, which needs to be utilized a lot more effectively. And it certainly is very complementary, therefore, to intermittent resources such as solar and wind. Hydropower, as we know, is not very heavily utilized, not utilized nearly enough within Africa, has been pointed out. Only about 9% of the resource has been tapped within sub-Saharan Africa. And so what this means is there are huge opportunities to develop it more as a resource and cheaper. But when we look at this resource that has a lot of problems and difficulties in getting built, so when we look at in the U.S., only about say 3% of dams are used for hydropower. Dams also provide flood control. They can control irrigation, transportation as a water source. There are huge benefits to having dams, but there are significant problems in building them in terms of the environmental and social impacts. So when we look at building this resource, why it's really needed is that we need to build this resource to provide the complementary access that solar and wind and other intermittent resources need. And so we have a lot of work to do to build up this resource. When we look at the main problem facing, whether it's hydro or solar or wind or anything else, I just want to back up and point out something that some of the other participants have covered, the myriad issues facing development. But one of the chief problems is the modern grids. We don't have modern grids typically within Africa. So we've got a huge amount of losses. There are technical losses as well too, from antiquated infrastructure that can't really handle the loads. But really it's the losses from like poor collections and that sort of thing. So what we really need are investments into these grids that increase the collections and reduce the losses, and then make the off-takers more financially sound. Because a lot of investors don't want to come into a project where if you're investing $10, the government is losing $1 because of the losses, and the government is your off-taker typically, the utilities, so they're in poor financial health. So if we can modernize the grids, like the backbone, like the system that is used, then we can bring on more hydropower, which is, as we know, typically when it's done correctly, a very inexpensive resource. And then, as mentioned by Sylvie, we can potentially reduce the tariffs. So Africans often pay the highest prices in the world for power, but that's largely because the systems are so inefficient that most are reliant on diesel generators paying 35 or 40 cents per kilowatt hour, because we don't have enough grid-based projects. So one of the biggest problems is, we need to get digital meters that will really increase the collection. So just as an example, there are markets that we look at, like say Nigeria, where they've got some areas are 70% losses. Some have even told me up to 80% losses. And you can't build anything in a system like that where the losses are so high, making it so that it's not really a financially sound investment. And then you have the issue of when governments say, oh, okay, we'll give you a sovereign guarantee. Well, what is a sovereign guarantee worth? So all of these instruments need to be, many different financial instruments, as has been mentioned by the other participants, need to be layered on to these very complex transactions. So, to answer your question, it's a resource that needs to be built. So why hydro? It is very attractive when it can be done correctly, and it is very complementary to solar and wind, where the price points have really come down, and hydro can really act as a massive battery. So now when we're talking about really trying to use baseload solar and wind, what you're really talking about is plus storage. And that storage component is rather pricey often. Still, pricing points again are coming down, but when you have hydropower with a dam as a massive battery, this is a fantastic system which needs to be utilized a lot more.
And Chris, you point out why hydro is useful, but you also point out the connectivity issue and the wastage. Now, keeping that in mind, what would you say the investors' outlook is to hydro in Africa in the coming years?
I'd say hydro is getting a closer look but a lot more work needs to go in to make this more attractive. So one of the areas that they've been investors have been looking at, and this is across the board, not just for hydro, but for anything large scale grid base, again, because of those losses, you invest into a losing entity, the off-taker, the utility and government. A lot of movement has been towards C&I, commercial and industrial opportunities, smaller projects that can be ring fenced a lot more easily in terms of collections. You can set up a smaller system where you can ensure that the collections are high, everything is fully metered, because now you're going to have typically a large off-taker. Perhaps it could be a commercial concern, 85% offtake by that commercial concern. And so it's basically, like a baseload or anchor tenant, as developers say, in terms of, you want to get the big supermarket on there first as their anchor tenant, and then the other small shops can come in and be on, in that system as well too, in terms of real estate development. Power development is often successful in the same way when you have that anchor load through having a large commercial entity. And so, we investors are looking at this much more closely. Power Africa has sponsored programs such as Invest, where we're really working hard to try to get more institutional capital interested and involved. And it's a long process where what we like to do first is try to organize and get the local investors engaged first. And this sort of serves as like a signal, like a proxy through which, if you get a local teachers union invested into like a hydro project, then now you have oversight. Their board might be, you might have a member on the board for the project, and you don't want to, they want to make sure that these teachers, the unions, don't lose their pension capital. And once you have that, then you might be able to get a teachers union from like the state of Illinois, somewhere from the US or Canada or elsewhere, interested as well. And then you can draw in more institutional capital. But we need to make these projects more financially sound first, so we can draw in all these investors.
So with those challenges in mind, do you think there are certain areas of key opportunities which are still available for investors in the current state of things?
Yes, but I think that we need to back up, and it's been pointed out a little bit, but hasn't really been focused on enough in terms of what we really need to do are really beef up the feasibility studies and the ESIAs, environmental and social impact assessments. And these need to be done, all your I's dotted, T's crossed, done very thoroughly to the highest standards, IFC protocols, hydropower sustainability assessment protocols. And we need to partner and work with groups like the EIB and the AFDB a lot more closely. We have written into our MOUs with like the government of Norway, for example, that they need to collaborate with us to build hydro projects to the highest standards. And it is through doing these feasibility studies and ESIAs in a very thorough way that you mitigate the risks to make them attractive for investors. So what has been done in the past is often these projects were done, like the feasibility studies were done on the cheap. So they weren't really robust enough to make investors feel comfortable, with all the risks involved. And so by that, we need to work also on the social engagement. Power Africa has provided like we created a handbook on social engagement, making sure that the community is involved and invested, and they're excited about the opportunity as well too, as opposed to fighting against the opportunity. So these voices need to be heard and engaged, and have them come on board to support these projects. And with that, again, the risks can be mitigated somewhat. So there's a big opportunity to do the projects more thoroughly, and we need to collaborate and work on these projects a lot more closely with our partners.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to now open the floor for questions. Anyone in the audience who has questions, please feel free to write them in the Q&A section and we'll pick up a few. But before we get questions from them, what I hear from all the three perspectives is that there is great opportunity, but there are several challenges. The biggest one being data, credibility of the output and feasibility. The next one, of course, being corruption, which was flagged mildly so, but in several levels, both at the government and the contractor side. The environmental concerns, the currency and convertibility risk, the foreign exchange risks. These are the main features which came out. From the solutions, what we heard is dependency on the more PPP model, getting the private sector to participate, getting the public at large to participate with their capital gives more confidence. My question to all the panelists today is, what can the development banks themselves do to ensure that there is credible data required from the state and the producer when it is presented? What kind of TNCs can be put in? What are the project requirements where you can put penalties or any of those sort of controls which can be introduced to ensure higher level of credibility in data?
Hello, yes, I'll just jump in since others haven't just yet. So as I was mentioning in my presentation part, was that we need the protocols to be adhered to. So the IFC protocols, hydropower sustainability assessment protocols. I think this is the way where we can achieve progress in this area and make sure that the standards are adhered to. Because again, this is how we can mitigate the risks to draw in investors. And without those high standards, banks, investors, they're just not interested, because it's a scary thing, and on one hand, but then what we've heard from some investors as well too is that some of the opportunities aren't all that exciting, enough to get jazzed up about, and we need to make them more attractive. And then you're talking about governments. Governments need to be much more helpful counterparts in the development. One of the things I often say is that one of the big issues we've seen, especially these large grid-based projects where tariffs have been renegotiated. And so to have like a 10-year project, and it's very difficult to get investors to the table. Developers have to work incredibly hard to get all these instruments, and then several years in, the governments want to renegotiate these projects. These are disasters. What we need instead are governments saying, please invest in my country because you're going to make more money here than anywhere else. What that means is, you can invest in Vietnam, you can invest in North Carolina, a state in America. You can invest in Switzerland, but here you're going to make a lot of money because we're going to work really hard to help you get this project done quickly and in less time than you had imagined, because we're not going to get in the way. We're going to support you. And we need a lot more of that to attract more investment. And again, it doesn't mean that the tariffs need to be higher. It just means that the government makes building a project a lot more easily done. Thank you.
All right. So the next question from my side, and sorry, anyone? Yes, Oliver.
Yeah, I just wanted to compliment Oliver. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Sylvie. I'll do that. I'll speak next. No problem.
Okay, I actually wanted to say that the question of the quality of data is a question for an engineer such as Oliver, so I'm happy he will be intervening. But just to mention that I think the initiative of developing the studies has to come from the governments, and feed off a very well developed energy master plan or least cost development plan that are going to identify very early on what are the next investments needed in the sector, you know, in the medium to long-term future, and start immediately with those studies. And of course, DFIs are there to provide technical assistance and grants to carry out those studies, because when they are not there, and we have to rely on, say, 2 years hydrological data, because it's the government has put the burden of developing those studies entirely on a new investors coming with appetite to invest in the sectors. That's very challenging afterwards for banks to come in and rely on so short-term data, especially when it comes to hydro, when you need much longer period of time for this data to be credible.
Yes, and I'll complement what Sylvia complimented before. But I think, yes, first, a strategic view is needed. When we say strategy, this does not correspond only to let's say politics in the country. It's also having, I think, of course, a river basin approach, a climate approach. These are strategic view, and there was a very important point that was flagged by Sylvia. This lack of transmission capacity, and Chris also mentioned that. The grid. Well, I think this is all connected. To let's say a low standards strategic approach in the countries. Well, not all of them, by the way, in Africa, and we see, difference between the countries. And I would like, to point out, the second point, the second thing is that while we are supporting, private investor as much as public investor, of course, and in particular in relation, to the debt of the state, so to alleviate this point, I think that the private sector also has to contribute in a much stronger manner to this strategic approach, and can't leave this and say, well, look, I'm sorry, this is none of my business. I just look into the project at the project level, and what's going on in the river is none of my business. And if it's about disclosing data, I don't want to, because it's confidential. That will definitely not help the hydropower sector to develop in Africa. One of the key points and key difference between Africa as a continent with South America or Europe or other continents is the knowledge, indeed, of the context, and for that, again, I reiterate. I think the strategic approach is key. You mentioned corruption. I think that corruption is everywhere in the world. We can't just say Africa has a problem with corruption. It's not about that. It's about opportunities and the easy way to get something done. And at one point, rules has to be set, rules has to be said and enforced, and everyone has to contribute. Private investor as much as public investor.
Thank you everyone for that. And I'll end the discussion with the last question, and I'm going to come back at it. What role can then be played by development institutions, development finance institutions, in creating this discipline, in using their rights or actions to discipline the state when things go wrong in the project at the fag end, when they realize there is corruption at the later stage? Should they be more hands-off as they have traditionally been, or should they be institutions which bring in good practices by getting litigious with states who have, in a sense, misrepresented or did not act as per their warranties when the performance of the project is taking place?
Well, I'll start this time then. Well, no, for DFIs, I think that we have a contradicting interest. So an interest in going fast. So we don't have many times to appraise, a lot of projects. So we want, the project to be done. We can't spend a lot of time in 10 years preparing project. Sylvie mentioned she's there, 10 years, but I'm not sure, there are many, colleagues who are staying, more than 10, 15 years in a DFI. So to follow, a project. So I think we clearly have to put our hands into supporting, best practice. I think, that's in EIB what we try to do with our guidelines, ENS guidelines, of course, and also I think that's the move that the bank, wants the EIB group wants to take with more development approach. Development is key, in hydropower, but it must be acknowledged also that indeed, DFI might not have the same timeline as the investor or the developers, and there is a real need to have a smooth implementation and to have a proactive collaboration between the parties, and to request for information up front, but not necessarily to request the DFI to be engaged all the time to ensure the proper implementation of this project. At the end of the day, if the things are not done properly, we will not finance. And that is the clear message I want to send, to the developers and the investors. If this is well done, if the documents are in place, then we can go very fast. This is clear.
Any more comments on this from the panel?
Yeah, I think the issue of corruption is especially or is more prominent in, say, public sector projects rather than private sector IPP. At least in my experience, in cases where AFDB is engaged in a hydro IPP, we will only support projects that have been going through international, competitive, transparent bidding process with all the rules that goes into it. And governments know that if the rules of the games are not being respected, they will have lawsuits in the back end of all that. So usually, at least the selection of the private sector partner and their subcontractors, EPC, O&M, is done, at least in the project the FDB is financing, in a clear, transparent, accountable way. And we have not experienced so far instances of corruption. But if I want to talk about the political risk in itself, which is oftentimes something that gets private investors to have cold feet in investing in Africa, there are solutions for the political risk, be it expropriation or civil war or crazy fluctuations of currency. And the FDB is offering, for example, this partial risk guarantee that is supposed to backstop such kind of risk and improve the bankability of the project, in the sense that it will then, the African Development Bank guarantee can be called if such events are materializing that prevents the project company to be paid. And therefore, at least for a certain period of time, 6 months to a year, the private company will be covered, which helps decreasing this political risk. And that has actually helped a lot of projects mobilizing private sector financing. In the slide that I showed earlier, I think at least half of them had the support of a partial risk guarantee or a PRI from MIGA.
Yes, and then I'll just add in, this is something that hasn't really been mentioned in terms of corruption. Is something that obviously, from the U.S. government, we're not able to involve ourselves in that, and that certainly don't permit any of our partners to do so either. So one of the areas that we really try to focus on, it's more of a structural thing, as I was mentioning with the grid, and this would be power purchase agreement complexity. So one of the things that we know is that in areas where corruption is more problematic, PPAs are very complex. And what we need are more standardized PPAs, simplified PPAs, where terms are obvious and clearly stated, and it's a lot more simpler to navigate. And the reason why we often see these complex PPAs, and these are purposefully designed, is that with a complex PPA, now you need your government counterpart to help you maneuver through the complexities for a fee. So if we can reduce these complexities and have simplified PPAs, I think this is something that we've been certainly working on our end, and getting them a lot more standardized would I think open things up quite a bit and reduce some of these issues. Thank you.
Before you can leave us, we have a couple of questions which have come in, but one, of course, is a comment which I think corruption is a big challenge, which comes in from one of the audience. But I think one last question, and this is, there are a few strong hydropower developers in the continent. What actions DFIs are doing to promote credible, experienced developers in the continent? And also, how can hydro IPPs compete with EPCs undertaken by, especially by Chinese companies that propose competitive terms?
Well, I'll take them in the ground. I don't. Maybe Sylvia. I mean, this time, I mean, up to you. I mean, I think that's balance.
Yeah, no, plus I want to say hi to Frederic Reves. We used to work together at African Development Bank for a few years, so it's wonderful to virtually see you again here, Frederic, and thank you for your question. So you know as well as I do, from having worked at the African Development Bank, that it's difficult for us to how do you say, to promote some developers just because we need to have this fair rule of the games, and we give the same, let's say, attention to all developers that knock at our doors, and we look at them or filter them with the same eligibility criteria in terms of financial, technical, reputational strength. And when you see, tender for hydropower project or other energy project on the continent, it's oftentimes the same club that is winning. And unfortunately, there's not much we can do about that, because a lot of these big, large-scale hydro projects require a lot of experience, and it's the same developers that have had that lead start required to qualify or pre-qualify for those tenders. And it's a tricky question about, you know, the can hydro IPPs compete with EPCs undertaken especially by Chinese companies. We've seen it in some countries. Okay, one of them is Madagascar, that you know also really well, because hydro IPPs, when it's supported by DFIs, of course, comes with a lot of rules and standards to be applied in terms of environmental and social safeguards. It takes a long time to go through all those consultations, to gather all the studies. We have the LTA involved, we have a panel of experts involved, and that can be really frustrating for a country to wait all this time. Also, the costs of financing IPPs are very high, as I mentioned, can be up to 25% of the total project costs, when if you go maybe with a Chinese EPC contractant with less stringent rules or consideration for ENS, and maybe you can save some of the financing costs. It comes with an ECA guarantee. It looks like it might be easier for the government. Also, large IPP projects are often very political. It's like flagship for the president of the country. He wants to cut that ribbon by the end of his mandate, so he has an incentive to go as fast as possible. But many times, I think African governments are just really open to the feedback from the DFIs. They trust us. They trust our advice. They want to do best for their population. They are aware of the risk, environmental risk and social risk of these infrastructures, and they want to avoid them also at all costs, because that would also have political negative implications if they're not being well taken care of. And also the stamp of DFIs investing in projects come with great credibility and great trust, and also encourages further investment from private sector in the country. So oftentimes it's an arbitrage to be made by the government. But what we've seen so far is that DFIs still have their place in supporting such IPPs. And as I said, in the past few years, actually, hydro IPPs have been on the rise in Africa when compared to just EPC schemes.
Oh well, I think, I mean, on the EIB side, this is an interesting, I mean, question. However, I mean, first, we do not finance not credible or inexperienced sponsor. So I mean, I don't know, I mean, if there is a question there. We only finance credible and experienced sponsors. And among them, I mean, there are indeed, I mean, European one, but there are also other one. There are big name, and there are also, I mean, small name, I think. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we do support, I mean, projects which are for the benefit of the country and in particular, I mean, to the end users. And of course, I mean, this has to be aligned with the interest of the promoter. I mean, that's another thing. I think the third point is what can DFI do in supporting, I mean, let's say hydropower development. I mean, as general, I mean, they are credible and experienced first, and this is a condition for us to move ahead. I think that we have to indeed, I mean, take risk in projects. So we are hydropower, I mean, sector is not a sector like solar. It entails technical, financial risk that we are keen on taking with different tools. I mean, to be sized to the project and to the profile of the developers, let's say, or the promoters. That's for sure. And I think that unless, I mean, I'm mistaken, we have tried to be as transparent as possible on what we can or what we cannot do, as said by Sylvie. Now, I mean, indeed, on a case by case, we, as I said, I mean, are ready, I mean, to discuss upfront each project, and then, I mean, to let's say, make clear what would be our expectation for a quick approval of a project, because there are approval which are taking time, of course. Finally, I think the second part of the question is the comparison, I mean, with the Chinese. I hope, I mean, Chinese are not, I mean, listening. We all know, I mean, all this kind of competition ongoing. From my standpoint, as an engineer, I'm sorry, I mean, to say that I'm afraid that the Chinese have, I mean, very similar, I mean, experience and technical knowledge as others. So in that sense, the question, I mean, could be a little bit also, let's say, more balanced in a way of what can a promoter brings, I mean, to a DFI to let them choose a project rather than another one. And for that, I mean, I would strongly encourage you, I mean, towards, I mean, technological, let's say, innovation, implementation of innovation, with, of course, I mean, clearly some view on the cost, delay, and the final benefit also for the country, more transparency and let's say sharing of benefit. Again, I mean, once again, a clear view on the standards which are applied there, and not to think, I mean, that okay, I mean, it's Africa, so I mean, it's going to be, I mean, easier. As unfortunately, I must say, I can still see that, and it's really unfortunate because even if we are bankers, we still have, I mean, some competence to make this kind of difference, and we are really scared by the reputation risk, and this is where, I mean, I see, I mean, that there could be, I mean, a kind of a common contribution of both the developers and the DFI to mitigate, I mean, all this risk, of course. That would,
Thank you, Olivier.
Move faster.
Chris, do you have something to add to this?
Yes. First off, I also want to say hello to Frederic. So again, Power Africa works on the ground, typically through our transaction advisors who are experts in the field. And Frederic was one of our star transaction advisors who would then provide the support directly to the host governments and as well as the private sector developers working on these projects. So in terms of getting more DFI support, so Power Africa is comprised of, obviously, I'm from the USAID side, but then we also have our Development Finance Corporation, which is our DFI. We need to do a lot more work in terms of trying to make like one-stop shopping possible. So one of the more attractive, opportunities by going with the Chinese EPC is that you get a one-stop shop where you get the financing, EPC, all the sourcing. It's a lot more easy. And I was an R&D engineer. I know about building high-tech products. It has been pointed out China can build the latest and greatest iPhone, or they can build a really cheap one as well too. And so they've got the capabilities of doing whatever the country wants. So it's a difficult competitor that we need to, I don't say work against, but maybe sometimes work with. So we need to collaborate more, but we need to collaborate amongst ourselves a lot more closely. So as I had noted in our renewed MOU signed with the government of Norway, you're talking about companies like SN Power. We need to collaborate a lot more to get these projects built. So that means us working with others where maybe we provide the social engagement expertise on the ground, again, with our transaction advisors in the field that we are contracting with. And then perhaps we get the government of Norway to work more on the environmental studies. So this is something that they've done very well. They work to the highest of compliance standards, and we need to engage with them a lot more effectively. One of the things that we need to do is when we look at COP and all the climate finance talk, and then again talk that needs to turn into action. You have like the Green Climate Fund. We need to access these sources and make people put their money where their mouth is, and fund to the highest of standards feasibility studies. So we need grants for some of these things to de-risk these projects. So we need to ask and then get the funding necessary for really thorough environmental and social impact assessments. And this probably needs to come from grant capital. So this is something that we need to drive at a lot more thoroughly to get access to this and then collaborate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for this session. And I hand it over to India Infra to close this session.